The recording system didn't work this morning, so I'm doing both sermons or messages here from home. I just finished the sermon from the worship service, which was called Grieving Death from the book of John, the raising of Lazarus. But now we'll do our normal Sunday school class from Genesis. So last week, we studied Genesis chapter 25, the last 5 verses. That's Genesis 25, verses 29 to 34. Verse 39 said, "Now Jacob cooked a stew, and Esau came in from the field, and he was weary." I told you Jacob was probably a good cook. He spent most of his time with his mother, Rebekah, and they probably did a lot of cooking. Esau probably didn't do a lot of cooking, at least not intense. Maybe he was an expert with the barbecue, so to speak, because he was always out hunting and perhaps frying meat. His father Isaac, though, also loved wild game meat, so Isaac would get some from his son son Esau. But normal fare for these people who were shepherds would have been sheep meat and goat's meat, along with some vegetables. But Esau was likely killing deer and gazelle and rabbits and birds to feed himself and his father. Now, it was allowed by God to hunt and eat wild game, with the caveat that you drained out all of the blood. In the Mosaic law, no blood was to be eaten. And that's because it goes all the way back to Noah, which was in Genesis chapter 9, verses 1 to 4, where God says the blood is the life, and the life is sacred to God. Now, if you killed a human and shed human blood, it was the death penalty. But to kill animal blood, it was allowed to kill animals as long as you drained out the blood. Probably that was because blood and life have a kind of sacredness to God. And that's because God used animal sacrifices to temporarily represent the atonement of the blood of Jesus in the future. So if blood represents salvation, blood's pretty important. You don't just eat it. Verse 30. "And Esau said to Jacob, 'Please feed me with that same red stew, for I am weary.' Therefore his name was called Edom." Now, the most common way of cooking meat in the ancient world was to make a stew. You boil it in liquids. The oddity, though, here is the reference to the stew being very red. And this is odd because not much food in the ancient world was red. Most of our red foods are red because we make tomato sauce with tomatoes, and also we have red peppers. In Asia at the time, in the Middle East, that they didn't have that because the Americas had not been discovered, and that's where tomatoes and red peppers are from. So in the ancient world, there was only a few spices and red lentils that could make food red. However, the red lentils, which were common, turned brown and were no longer red when they were cooked. Now, we're even told later that this was a lentil soup. So there are 2 guesses as to why the soup might have been very red. One is that the stew was still raw. Jacob had just put in the lentils and they hadn't cooked yet. Therefore, they were still red, not yet brown. And Esau was so famished, he just wanted to eat them now. He didn't care if they were cooked or not. That's certainly a good possibility. The other possibility is that red also does mean reddish brown in Hebrew. And so it didn't have to be bright red. And in fact, you think of the red heifer. The red heifer was not really red. It was reddish brown. And so we're just talking about a reddish brown stew. But the funny thing, probably, is that Moses keeps bringing up that this is even why we call him Edom. Edom is one of the alternate names of Esau, which does mean red. But I suspect that this is just Moses playing with words here. It seems to be a kind of a Hebrew joke. In other words, Esau was born hairy and red. His hair was apparently red, and his skin was red. And now, later in life, he wants red stew. So we can just call Esau red all around because he was born red and he's still red. I think it's kind of a joke with Moses making fun of Esau. Now verses 31 and 32. "But Jacob said, 'Sell me your birthright as of this day.' And Esau said, 'Look, I'm about to die. So what is this birthright to me?'" So we looked at the concept of the birthright from Deuteronomy chapter 22. The birthright belongs to the firstborn son, whether his father likes him or not. So the father can't just decide, well, I like Jacob better than Esau, so I'm going to give the birthright to Jacob because I like him. Well, that's not allowed. You have to give it to the firstborn, and Esau came out first, even though it was only by a few seconds. Now, the question, why do you care about a birthright? Well, if you've got the birthright, when your father dies or when he leaves you his inheritance, even before he dies, you get twice as much as anyone else. So you get the lion's share of the inheritance. We don't know exactly how the birthright was kept. Did Esau own a little rock that Isaac had written on that meant that was the birthright? Or maybe it was his staff, the staff of Abraham, and now it's the staff of Isaac, and then it'll be the staff of Esau. We don't really know. It might have been a written contract, just saying that Isaac, testify that Esau is my oldest son and he has the birthright. It could be any of those things. But at any rate, whatever it was, Esau transferred it to Jacob for a bowl of stew. And that does also mean that a birthright can be given up voluntarily. It can't be stolen, but it can be voluntarily given up. And in other countries of the ancient world, it's obvious that you can lose your birthright if you're unworthy. In other words, there were obligations of being the oldest son. And you can't just be as wicked and nasty and evil as you want and still keep the birthright. If you get too far out of hand, they can take it away from you. And we saw that from Genesis chapter 49, which we looked at last week. When Jacob was dying in Egypt with all of his sons, and including Joseph, the firstborn child of Jacob was Reuben. But when the blessing came around, Jacob told Reuben, I am not giving you the birthright nor the blessing. You forfeited it because you slept with one of my concubines, whose name was Bilhah. And since you've done this, you're too wicked to earn the birthright. So even though you're the firstborn, I'm giving it to the secondborn, who was the firstborn from Rachel. And that's how Reuben lost his birthright. So you can lose it by forfeiting it for your evil, or you can voluntarily give it up, as Esau did. So verses 33 and 34. Then Jacob said, swear to me as of this day. So he swore to him, and he sold his birthright to Jacob. And Jacob gave Esau bread and stew of lentils. Then he ate and drank, arose, and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. Now, although the topic for last week was Esau in particular, we also needed to look at Jacob, because as you can see, Esau is wicked, but Jacob is not a whole lot better. A kind brother would have offered his brother food free. Your brother's starving and you've got food on the stove. You would just give him some. I mean, that's just what you would do as a good brother, as a family member. But he didn't. In fact, Jacob took advantage of the fact that Esau was hungry and demanded a huge price. You could say to your brother, yeah, sure, I'll give you some of my mac and cheese for a couple of bucks. Okay, fine. But you can't say to your brother, okay, fine, I'll give you some mac and cheese if you give me your car or your house. It's just an outrageous demand for something so small. And yet, Jacob asks it and Esau grants it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But Esau is an impulsive person. He has no self-control. And when Esau demonstrated that he didn't care much about the future blessings of God that were promised to the line of the Messiah, it just proved that Esau was never a part of that line. People who care nothing about the blessings of the church or the kingdom of God aren't in the kingdom of Christ. And that is the contrast with Jacob. Jacob is sinning against his brother, and yet he is showing that he cares about the future blessing. He knows Esau doesn't care, but he cares, and he's going to do something about it. He's taking the long view. Jacob is jealous of his brother, not because he's not a skilled hunter, but because Esau is going to receive the promises of God. Jacob desperately wants to be a part of the line of the Messiah. And it appears that perhaps he has tried to get in good with his father, Isaac. He's stayed home. He's worked with the cattle, all the sheep and the goats. He's become an expert shepherd, as we'll see next week or in a couple of weeks. So Jacob took a different path. Esau is just out doing whatever he wants, hunting and bringing food back to Isaac. And apparently, as you'll see later, he's sleeping around too. So Jacob and Rebekah became plotters. They both plotted to take away Esau's place as the firstborn. And they thought they had good reason for it, because Jesus himself had told Rebekah during her pregnancy that the older will serve the younger. So they think, okay, well, if the older is going to serve the younger, then Rebekah figures, hey, I'm going to help the younger because he's going to be in charge someday. And so they plot together against Esau. That was wrong, but they were doing God's will in a sense, his ultimate will, not his moral will. However, despite their sinfulness, they showed that they cared about the promises of God, whereas Esau didn't care at all about the promises of God. And we looked at this especially in Genesis chapter 32. I just want you to see some of the character of Jacob again. From Genesis 32, this is probably decades later. Genesis 32, verses 24 to 28. Then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of day. Now when he saw that he did not prevail against him, he touched the socket of his hip. And the socket of Jacob's hip was out of joint as he wrestled with him. And he said, "Let me go, for the day breaks." But he said, "I will not let you go until you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" He said, "Jacob." And he said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed." In other words, Jacob's life, as Jesus says here, has been one of struggling and striving. He's never satisfied. He always wants more. Now, often that showed itself in deceit, though not always. But the strongest quality of Jacob is his ambition, or perseverance might be another way of putting it. Not that naked ambition is good. I'm not saying that it's good to love money and love sex and love power and be ambitious for those things. No, Jacob's ambition is to be blessed by God and be part of the plans of God. He wants to be a part of it and not left behind. And God's going to honor that desire. So that ends the review. And today we will cover the entire chapter, Genesis chapter 26. It is quite a long chapter, but we'll go through it rather quickly because it only has one or two main themes. Genesis 26, verse 1. There was a famine in the land, beside the first famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, in Gerar. Now I have to admit I made at least half a mistake regarding the presence of the Philistines, because as I told you in the past, these are not the same Philistines that you run into in the book of Judges and Samuel, with Goliath and such. However, they are what you might call them proto-Philistines. You see, the Hebrew word for Philistines just means sea people, or people from the sea. And so these people apparently came from the sea and did live in the same region as the later Philistines. However, these people are not powerful at all. They only seem to have one or two cities, fairly small, and as you'll see later, Isaac is more powerful than these Philistines. So even though the chapter does call them Philistines, we can call them that. Just don't mix them up with the later Philistines who came over during the time of Moses. You see, what happened later, during the time of Moses, a giant group of Greek people got in boats and tried to invade Egypt. They were repulsed and their navy destroyed, so they couldn't sail home. So they just marched away from Egypt to the northeast and settled in the land halfway between Egypt and Judea. And that's how the Philistines got settled there. Those were the powerful Philistines. They are a few hundred years away. Now verses 2 and 3. Then the Lord appeared to him and said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land of which I tell you. Dwell in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and your descendants I will give all these lands, and I will perform the oath which I swore to Abraham your father. And I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven. I will give to your descendants all these lands, and in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws." So Jesus spoke to Isaac, again, he's spoken to him before, in a similar manner to the way he spoke with Abraham, but Isaac is never called God's friend like Abraham was. And we're not going to go over these verses carefully because we've gone over them before in the promises to Abraham and Isaac from prior chapters. But I do want you to notice a couple of important points here. First of all, we learned that there is a severe famine in the land, and that means that the plants aren't growing. It probably hasn't rained, or perhaps there's some kind of blight that's killing all the plants, and so the sheep can't be adequately fed, and the people can't be adequately fed. And this had happened to Abraham also. And Abraham's solution was to travel to Egypt where there was plenty of food. Here, though, Jesus intercepts Isaac on his way to Egypt, and he tells Isaac specifically not to go there. You remember all the trouble that Abraham got into in Egypt? He got to Egypt, and then he was afraid of their powerful nation, and then he was afraid they'd think Sarai was too beautiful and that they'd kill him. So they started lying and saying she's my sister instead of my wife, and the Pharaoh took her in and was going to sleep with her, But God warned him in a dream, I'm going to kill you because you've stolen someone's wife. And the Pharaoh says, what? I didn't know. And gives Sarah back and then sends Abraham out of Egypt with Hagar. So Abraham got rich in Egypt, but he also got a lot of messes, a lot of troubles. So Jesus tells Isaac, don't go to Egypt. And Isaac obeys. But he doesn't completely obey, as near as I can tell. It appears that Isaac and Rebekah and his people were already 1/3 to 1/2 of the way to Egypt. And they stop in the land of the Philistines. Gerar is far to the south and west of Judea. So Isaac's 1/3 of the way to Egypt, and he stops there and he dwells in Gerar. But Jesus also emphasized repeatedly, I want you to stay in the land that I'm giving you, the land that I promised to you and Abraham and all of your seed. That's where you should live, not anywhere else. So don't go to Egypt. Well, Isaac took that last piece. Okay, I won't go to Egypt. But he didn't stay in the land that God had promised him because we're not really sure. In fact, I kind of doubt that this land of Gerar was part of the promise to Isaac and Abraham. At least they never did take it. So he doesn't return to Judea. He just says, okay, I won't go to Egypt, and he stays where he is in Gerar. Now verses 6 and 7. So Isaac dwelt in Gerar, and the men of the place asked about his wife. And she said, oh, she's my sister. For he was afraid to say, she is my wife, because he thought, lest the men of this place kill me for Rebekah, because she is beautiful to behold. Now, before we start talking about the actual lie, we need to talk about the difficulty in the chronology of Genesis chapter 26. In other words, I do not believe, along with many other scholars, I do not believe that Genesis 26 is chronologically after Genesis 25. In fact, I think it is a prequel to Genesis 25, and I'll explain why that is. One reason is that in this chapter, Jacob and Esau aren't mentioned until the last couple verses. So they're not in this whole story. How can that be when we're talking about Rebekah and Isaac living in the Philistine territory? Where are the kids? Secondly, we love things to be in chronological order, and I do especially. That's one reason I'm going through Luke. But you need to understand that in the ancient world, histories were not chronological ever until about 500 BC when the Greeks started writing history. You see, before histories were written, let's say you were going to write a history of a king, Hammurabi. Okay, so you want to write a history of Hammurabi. So what do you do if you're a historian of the time? You write a couple of chapters on Hammurabi's military exploits, and you write a couple of chapters on Hammurabi's great learning and intelligence and how many languages he knew. And then you talk about Hammurabi's family and his sons and his relatives. And then you talk about this and that, all these aspects of Hammurabi, and they're not in any order. You're just laying it all out. That's what most histories were like. And Genesis does have a few places where the chronology is weird, and I think this is one of them. In other words, this is thematically. This is done thematically rather than chronologically here. Now, you know that I'm not a liberal, and I don't believe that 4 different authors cobbled the book of Genesis together while they were in Babylon 500 years before Jesus. That's nonsense. However, it is true that there can be a thematic approach in our histories, and this is one case. So here, why do I think that this has happened? I believe Moses is doing this on purpose. Genesis 25 tells us about the story of Jacob and Esau and the stew. And it also tells us, Genesis 25 starts to point out the dysfunctionality of their family. Isaac and Rebekah are at odds. Jacob and Esau are at odds. They're not doing things as a good family should. Why are they dysfunctional? Now Moses gives you 26 to show you that Isaac and Rebekah, their dysfunctionality shows long before Jacob and Esau were even born. In other words, the sins of the fathers come down on or to the children later. In other words, we're learning that Isaac was not a bad man, but he was not Abraham. He doesn't live up to Abraham. Abraham made messes, but Isaac makes messes even worse. And so I tentatively agree that the purpose of chapter 28 is to show you Isaac's family and why they were dysfunctional. So this is not an interlude. And that's why Jacob and Esau don't appear in these stories until the very end of chapter 26. So at any rate, even though Isaac didn't go into Egypt, he ran into the same problem as Abraham. He was insecure with his relationship with his beautiful younger wife, and that he came up with exactly the same lies that his father used. Well, think about this. In the case of Abraham and Sarai, Abraham was 10 years older than Sarai, and yet she was still gorgeous, apparently. Well, just think of poor Isaac. Isaac was 40 when he married his 13-year-old bride. So that's 27 years difference. So you can imagine that when you go to a country and they see this 40-year-old man with this 13-year-old girl, I'm almost surprised that he didn't say, oh, that's my daughter. It would have been more true in some ways, because you realize that when Abraham lied, it was only a half lie, still a lie, but Sarai was actually his half sister. But with Isaac, that's not true. Rebecca is not his half sister. She's just his cousin. So he's just flat out lying. There's no truth at all to what he has to say. So now verses 8 and 9. Now it came to pass when he had been there a long time that Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked out the window and saw, and there was Isaac showing endearment to Rebekah his wife. Then Abimelech called Isaac and said, quite obviously, she is your wife. How could you say she is my sister? And Isaac said to him, because I said, lest I die on account of her. Now, just as an aside, before we get to the lie itself, Abimelech is not probably the same man whom Abraham met 50 years earlier. Abimelech is a title. It means kingly father or father of the kingdom. So all it means is that this is the guy in charge of the Philistines. So it's probably not the same man who Abraham lied to all those years ago. It's a different guy. It sounds, though, like what happened is the king looked out of his window and Isaac and Rebekah were cavorting. I don't know if that's a good word for it. The New King James says showing endearment. Another translation says sporting. They were sporting together. In other words, they were fondling each other. And the king saw it and said, this can't be your sister. And that would be true. It was not his sister. So he calls in Isaac and he demands an explanation. And Isaac says, I was afraid you'd kill me and steal her. Verses 10 and 11. And Abimelech said, what is this you've done to us? One of the people might have lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt on us. So Abimelech charged all his people, saying, he who touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death. Now, luckily for Isaac, nobody tried to steal Rebekah at this point. But the king knows that bad things can happen, and he orders his people to leave Isaac and Rebekah alone. Now, why would he do that? Why would he order them to stay away? Probably because Isaac is more powerful than the Philistine king at this point. But still, he has just been rebuked by a pagan king for being a hypocrite. How would you like that as a supposedly godly person, and your evil friends discover how evil you are and rebuke you for being evil? That's pretty low, pretty sad. But he doesn't exile them, at least yet. Verses 12 through 14. Then Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold, and the Lord blessed him. The man began to prosper and continued prospering until he became very prosperous, for he had possessions of flocks and possessions of herds and a great number of servants, so that the Philistines envied him. Now what this means is, in spite of Isaac's sins, God is still blessing him. And that's because he's still the child in the line of the child of promise, the promise to Abraham and his seed that they would be blessed. At least his chosen children would. But as Isaac became wealthy during this famine, the locals in Gerar become envious. So verses 14 through 16. Now the Philistines had stopped up all the wells which his father's servants had dug in the days of Abraham his father, and they had filled them with earth. And Abimelech said to Isaac, go away from us, for you are much mightier than we. Now, when it says that the Philistines had filled in the wells, it doesn't mean that as soon as Isaac had this great 100-fold crop, that the Philistines got angry and went and filled in the wells. No, this is talking about the past. And what it means is, basically, when Abraham died, his covenant with the old Abimelech was over. They made a covenant, and the king said, okay, you can have these wells here as long as you're alive. But when Abraham dies, the deal's off. Isaac hasn't made a new deal. So the Philistines filled up the wells in case they want them later. But finally, Abimelech does tell Isaac and his people to go away because they were becoming too rich and powerful. Now verses 17 through 22. Then Isaac departed from there and pitched his tent in the valley of Gerar, and dwelt there. And Isaac dug again the wells of water which they had dug in the days of Abraham his father, for the Philistines had stopped them up after the death of Abraham. He called them by the names that his father called them. Also Isaac's servants dug in the valley, and they found a well of running water there. But the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with Isaac's herdsmen, saying, "This water is ours." So he called the name of the well Esek, because they quarreled with him. Then they dug another well, and they quarreled over that one also. So he called its name Sitnah. And he moved from there and dug another well, and they did not quarrel over it. So he called its name Rehoboth, because he said, "For now the Lord has made room for us, for we shall be fruitful in the land." So when Abimelech kicks Isaac and the family out, they move north into the countryside, and he dug up some wells to use, but the Philistines contested all of them. "You can't have that water, that's our water." So they kept moving farther north. Finally, they found one that the Philistines didn't care about, and Isaac says, "We can be fruitful here." But now look at verses 23 to 25. Then he went up from there to Beersheba, and the Lord appeared to him that same night and said, "I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not fear, for I am with you. I will bless you and multiply your descendants for my servant Abraham's sake." So he built an altar there and called on the name of the Lord, and he pitched his tent there, and there Isaac's servants dug a well. Now you might wonder, why, after finding that well at Rehoboth, why did Isaac just up and move again and go farther north to dig another well? Well, here's my opinion. Oh, and also, why did God allow the Philistines to chase them off their wells? If God promised him all this land and they've got wells, shouldn't God allow Isaac to defend those wells? No, actually, I believe that even though Isaac could have had water there, I think he finally wised up. In other words, they left Gerar, they dug a well, say 5 miles north of the city. And the Philistine says, "No, you can't have that well." So they move another 5 miles north and they dig a well. And the Philistines say, "No, you can't have that well." So they move 10 miles further north and they dig a well, and there they're allowed to dig the well. The Philistines don't care. But Isaac moves again 10 miles farther north. Why? Because I think he finally realized what God was trying to tell him: get back in your own land. And the southernmost part of that land was Beersheba, not Rehoboth. So in other words, Isaac finally figured it out. God's allowing the Philistines to push me back to my own land. And so this time I'll just go. So this is actually obedience, I believe. Rather than staying at Rehoboth, even though he could have, he moved back to Beersheba. And now verses 26 and 27. Then Abimelech came to him from Gerar with Ahuzath, one of his friends, and Phicol, the commander of his army. And Isaac said to them, "Why have you come to me, since you hate me and sent me away from you?" Now again, I want to point out this guy Phicol, because there was a Phicol with Abimelech in the story with Abraham. And so liberals say, oh, obviously this was the story of Abraham repeated just like Isaac. So Isaac lied just like Abraham. They met Abimelech, they met Phicol. It's just a confusion. The same story being told twice because they were too stupid to notice they made a mistake. No, that's not what it is. The same things happen twice, and the guys have the same names because they are titles. Just like Abimelech means king of the land, Phicol just means the great man, which means the guy with the most power. He has the army. So Phicol is just the guy in charge of the Philistine army. So it doesn't prove that the story is wrong. But it is interesting that Isaac was angry about getting kicked out of Gerar so unceremoniously. And he asked, "Why have you come to bother me now? You kicked me out, we left. What do you want now?" In verses 28 and 29. But they said, "We have certainly seen that the Lord is with you. So we said, let there now be an oath between us, between you and us, and let us make a covenant with you, that you will do us no harm, since we have not touched you, and since we have done nothing to you but good, and sent you away in peace. You are now the blessed of the Lord." I think that what happened here is Abimelech realized how stupid he was to kick Isaac out. If he already is afraid that Isaac is more powerful than him, what's to keep Isaac from just conquering him and taking over the city of Gerar? He could have had it any time he wanted. So it was pretty stupid for Abimelech to kick him out, especially seeing how powerful and rich he was becoming. So Abimelech goes to Isaac now that he's out of town and kind of apologizes. This is sort of an apology. I'd really like you guys to be friends with us. We were nice to you. Could you be nice to us and not attack us? And we'll make a covenant with you just like we made with your dad. And so now you see that even wicked men can recognize when God's on someone's side. And verse 31. So he made them a feast, they ate and they drank. Then they arose early in the morning and swore an oath with one another. And Isaac sent them away, and they departed from him in peace. So why is it that Isaac didn't just conquer the Philistines? He could have. That's the normal thing to do. If you're really powerful and somebody else is causing you trouble and filling up your wells with dirt, you could go just conquer them and make them serve you. Why didn't Isaac do that? Because I think he realizes now that this isn't the land God wants him to have. He wants him to be north more. And so Isaac goes up there and says, okay, I don't need that land down there anyway, halfway to Egypt. So they made peace. But the good news from that day isn't over yet, as you see in verses 32 and 33, which are the last verses of the chapter. It came to pass that same day that Isaac's servants came and told him about the well which they had dug, and said to him, we have found water. So he called it Sheba. Therefore the name of the city is Beersheba to this day. And once again, liberals whine about the contradictions in this chapter, because remember, Abraham founded the well at Beersheba. Now it says that Isaac founded it and named it Beersheba. But it doesn't say that Isaac founded it for the first time. Remember, we were told that after Abraham died, the Philistines filled it in. It wasn't just a geyser. It's not like you just watched for the water to pop up out of the ground and you knew where the well was. No, the Philistines had hid it. So what this means is that the servants of Isaac were digging around and they found the original well of Beersheba, and Isaac renamed it Beersheba because he found it again. That's all it means. So all that we've done in Genesis 26, I believe, was a prequel, explaining what Isaac's life was before they had Jacob and Esau. Oh, but there are a couple of verses left that include Esau. So look at the last verses. I was wrong before. It was verses 34 and 35 that were last. When Esau was 40 years old, he took as wives Judith, the daughter of Beeri the Hittite, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, and they were a grief of mind to Isaac and Rebekah. So now we'll talk more about where does this fall in the timeline. We don't know how old Esau and Jacob were in Genesis 25, the story with the stew. But here I can make an educated guess. I think that Esau was 40 when that story of the stew came, or maybe 41. And here's the reason. It might help to explain why Jacob and Rebekah were ready to start their plan to supplant Esau as the blessed one. That's because Esau started making bad choices. When he was 40, he started taking foreign wives, and this became a problem. Both Isaac and Rebekah hated these new wives. Now, why would they hate these new wives? Probably because one of the greatest events in Isaac's life was that Abraham sent a messenger to find him a God-fearing wife from his own people back in Syria. So it should be obvious to Esau that if Abraham would do that, Isaac would do that also. Now, there's an interesting question. Why didn't Isaac find a wife for Esau? Perhaps it's partly Isaac's fault for not doing so. But at any rate, at age 40, Esau decided to get married, and he married a couple of Hittite girls. They would be from Syria or from Judea in the mountains there, near Hebron. Esau believes that rules don't apply to him. He's probably been spoiled. His father has protected him all these years because he gives him the game meat that he loves. And so he no longer even feels responsible to avoid sin. He does whatever he wants, and this becomes a grief to Isaac. Now, obviously, though, Isaac doesn't think that this bad marriage should keep Esau from getting the blessing. And he still intends to give Isaac the blessing, or Esau the blessing, even though he's becoming wicked. But Jacob and Rebekah recognize that this must be the time to supplant Esau, when his father is also displeased with him. And so I suspect that that's when the story of the stew happened. So now for the application. So basically I'm saying that whole first part of chapter 26 belonged, and so did the marriage with the foreign women belonged right before the stew incident in chapter 25. But the application is pretty obvious. The most obvious truth is that Genesis 26 shows that the sins of the father affect the children very badly. Abraham was sometimes a coward and sometimes a liar, and that comes probably because he was fearful and deceptive. Now, of course, the opposite is also true, however. Not only the sins and flaws of the father come down on the children, but also the virtues and good character can be influential on the children. What we can say is that at its root, the influence of parents on children is partly related to common grace, but it is more closely related to the child's own soul. In other words, even a wicked man or a wicked woman can pass good traits on to the children. Now, by good, I do not mean virtuous, I mean civil, traits that are praised by God, that are important to communities. For example, it's possible to teach intelligence, kindness, integrity, and even a sort of love, not a deep love, but a sort of love, from wicked teachers to wicked students. It won't bring them salvation or praise before God on the last day, but it is praiseworthy enough that secular society will accept it. And those kind of people will be judged less severely than those who are wicked even in civil matters. Well, in that way, common grace can bring good teaching to children. So, even Ishmael surely learned some good qualities from Abraham. And Esau also surely learned some good things from Isaac. Yet, neither Ishmael nor Esau was a child of God. So, what is far more important in the raising of children than just the parental teaching is that the children be saved and be children of God. That is necessary for them to learn any virtue or righteousness. Because without that, the children can learn to be polite, they can have good etiquette, they can be socially acceptable. But if they are not saved, they are still children of the devil. They are not good. They cannot do anything righteous. They can't. How can a wicked child do anything righteous when they have a dead heart, they're slaves to Satan, the world, and the flesh? They are at enmity with God. So the fact is that any unsaved child can do nothing that is truly righteous. Thus, they can only learn basic civility from their parents. Now, sins and virtues both are passed to children. And we say that every week in our church service when we cite the Ten Commandments. It's the blessing and the curse of the Ten Commandments. It's Exodus 20, verses 5 and 6. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, unto the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. Now, as I've said before, this is not a promise to punish children for their wicked parents, nor is it a promise to reward children because they had good parents. In each case, the implication is that the children imitate the parents in either their sin or their virtue, and the children will be punished or rewarded for their own sin and virtue. In other words, those who hate God tend to influence their children to hate God and thus to sin. Also, those who love God and obey God tend to influence their children to obey God and love God. The parents are culpable for any evils they cause by their sins in the sight of their children. However, the children are responsible for their own evils in following a wicked parent and ignoring the love and grace of God. Isaac learned fear and deceit from his father Abraham. Probably Abraham learned it from his own father. And you can already see the deceit welling up in Jacob. And we'll look at that more closely next week. But the other application of this passage is that God is faithful to his promises even when the recipient is unworthy. In fact, that's an extreme understatement. The truth is that every blessing from God that comes upon every human, since we are all unworthy all the time, is grace. It's nothing but grace. God brought blessings on Isaac even when he remained in pagan territory, even when he lied to Abimelech, even when he was not a great father. Isaac was not a great man, he was a good man. And the reason he got blessing is because God promised it, even though he didn't deserve it. And that's true of us also. God gives us grace when we don't deserve it. In fact, you've never deserved it, and I have never deserved it. God has never given you grace because you deserved it. And I didn't get it based on my character or my deeds, because then it wouldn't be grace. It would be reward. Jacob must have understood that, and that was part of Jacob's faith. He understood that the blessing of God was from grace.